All right, welcome everybody to the May 2016 Mississippi PowerShell User Group meeting. Tonight we're going to hear Chef Principal Engineer and Microsoft MVP Steven Murawski present on acceptance testing DSC with Test Kitchen. So welcome Steve, and take it away.
Hey, thanks Ron. I'm really happy to be here talking about this because this is a really important topic to me. I love the configuration management space, and so DSC and Chef, and that's where I make my living now. But one of the key things that I've found is there's a big hurdle in getting to trust configuration management, and what I found is this tool called Test Kitchen that can really help build that level of trust, and also help make building configurations to manage your servers a lot more fun and a lot less painful. So we're gonna spend some time tonight kind of digging into this thing called Test Kitchen, and we'll start off with a couple of slides. Should have coming up for you here real shortly, and as we go through this, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I will periodically check over and look for questions. No questions off limits. And if you're thinking it, somebody else is thinking it, or somebody else who's coming back to watch the recording might be, having a similar question. So please go ahead and ask. I've been working with Test Kitchen now for almost 2 years, so things that might be kind of stuck in my brain might not be readily apparent, and so please definitely ask questions as we go. All right. So I can't actually tell from the client if you guys are seeing my slides and things, so also please throw in the conversation if what I'm talking about doesn't actually appear to be kind of what's in front of you. So we're going to try to answer a couple questions here tonight, and the first off is going to be, what is Test Kitchen? We'll look at we'll talk about how to get it, and then we're really going to spend time on how it works and why you should want to use that. And there's all of 7 slides, so most of this is going to be demo and us going through and doing fun stuff. So Test Kitchen itself is a integration testing framework. It doesn't do all that much by itself, but it takes advantage. What it does is it helps you glue together a bunch of different stuff that you need to actually do this kind of testing. And I suppose I should explain what kind of testing we're talking about. And you're probably getting hammered with, hey, you need to go learn Pester, and you need to be writing tests for your PowerShell code and all that kind of stuff. And yes, you do need to be doing all that stuff. But what we're talking about here tonight is integration or acceptance testing. And basically, we want to find out if the configuration management thing that we're doing actually did the thing on the system that we thought it did. So to give it a more concrete example, if I tell a service in my DSC configuration that I expect it to be disabled, is it actually disabled, or is it just stopped? If I tell it I want a website, is that site listening on the correct port? Is their content being served? You want to make sure that all of you don't want to trust your configuration management tool's output that says, oh yeah, I did all that stuff. This is a trust but verify kind of step. And so what Test Kitchen allows you to do is to wire together a couple of different things. You have a mechanism to spin up a virtual machine, whether locally or on a VMware cluster, or in a cloud like AWS or Azure, or spin up Docker containers, spin up some kind of environment to actually apply a configuration to. Then you want a tool that's going to go and apply the configuration. Then another tool to test and validate that it did what you thought it did. And so we're going to dive a little deeper into how that actually looks and how that actually comes together. So the first part that we're going to look at is the driver. And that's basically how we get the virtual environment to work in. And I say virtual environment, there are actually a couple of drivers that will go against physical machines. Usually we say virtual environment because you're going to spin something up fresh, apply a configuration to it, test it, rip it down, and be able to do this over and over and over again. But as you can see from the slide, there's a number of different options. You can there's drivers for Hyper-V, VirtualBox, Docker, Azure, AWS, Google Compute, DigitalOcean, you name it. There's probably a driver for it somewhere. Later, I'll show you on the project site. There's an ecosystem document that has a bunch of the different community plugins that are out there and available. Then we have provisioners. And the reason I'm kind of running through these here is driver, provisioner, verifier. These are terms that we're going to use inside the configuration document for Test Kitchen. So provisioner is how we actually apply a configuration to a node. And it can be DSC, it can be Chef, it can be Puppet, it can be shell scripts, it can be CF engine. There's a number of different options for how you're going to apply something to that node. Then we get to the verifiers, and to me, this is one of the most important parts of Test Kitchen. And this is a different tool that we use to validate that our configuration did what we expect. And this, to me, is what helps us build the trust in the configurations that we build, so that when we push them out into production, that we know how they're going to behave. We know that they're going to do what we expect them to do, and no more. And given a certain scenario, we know what's going to happen on our servers. There's a couple other terms that we're going to have to work with, and that's platforms. So one thing that I've come across is that most people, when they're in their environments, they do not have just one server type in their environment. You might have 2008 R2, 2012 R2, might be playing with SQL or Server 2016 TP5. You might have a variety of these platforms out there that you need to support. Or you might be in the process of a migration from 2008 R2 to 2012 or something like that. And so Test Kitchen makes it very easy to inject another platform to test against. And we'll look at how that kind of shakes out. We'll actually do that. We're going to start testing a Server 2012 R2 node with WMF4, so kind of a stock 2012 R2 box. And then we're going to add a node with WMF5 RTM to make sure that the configurations we're building will work against both 2012 and 2012 R2, 2012 R2 with WMF4 and one with WMF5. Then we have our suites. Now, a suite is kind of the result set that we get from Test Kitchen, and that will match up a particular configuration test case along with a platform. And so for each platform and each test case, it's going to have an individual test run. And that is what is going to, that's what kind of makes this really, really powerful. And let's kind of take a look at how that all shakes out here. We're going to start in our text editor. And we're going to start with a moderately complex Kitchen YAML. There's a lot simpler ones that we can do, but this one's going to work for us right away. And Test Kitchen uses this Kitchen YAML file as its primary interface that we work with. So this is where all the configuration options for how it runs get set. There's a couple of things we can pass at the command line, but primarily this is our interface for working. This configuration or this Kitchen YAML at the end of our session, I'm going to finish pushing this up to GitHub, and I'll show you the repository it's going to go to. But I'm using a fork of the X-Web administration module from the PowerShell team's GitHub organization. And so it'll be in my GitHub repository, but it's a fork of the X-Web administration module. So I'm going to walk through our steps. So we talked about driver. In this case, I'm going to be using Vagrant. Vagrant is a tool from HashiCorp that allows you to, it abstracts away the different virtualization platforms, so you can work in a similar fashion with tools like Hyper-V and VirtualBox and VMware Fusion, and there's also some integrations to some different cloud platforms and things as well. So Vagrant, I'm using Vagrant here on my Mac. On my Windows box, I tend to use the Hyper-V provisioner, and the Hyper-V driver. And the driver is sort of irrelevant, or becomes irrelevant after you've figured out what the exact settings you need to set are. But that's what tells us, okay, what's going to spin up these virtual machines that I need to test. And so I've got some customizations to it. Each driver is going to have some different options. So Vagrant supports linked clones, which allows you to spin up your machine a little bit faster. I don't want it popping up a UI for VirtualBox, so that I would see the UI for it. I don't care about that. That gets in the way. I'm going to communicate with these machines over WinRM, and I want to give them each 2 CPUs and 4 gig of memory. So, and I could trim that down, but for purposes of our talk here tonight, I'm going to go with the higher memory amount so we can have a little bit better performance as we go through. The next thing I have is a provisioner. And given I'm talking about desired state configuration tonight, we're going to do the DSC provisioner. There's also Chef provisioners, Chef Zero and Chef Solo. There's Puppet provisioners. There's Ansible. There's Shell provisioner, where you can just run some command line actions. So there's a lot of different things you can do provisioner-wise. And the DSC provisioner is one that I've written. So please go out, use it, and give me some feedback. I'm happy to make improvements and updates to it, and we'll talk about some of the capabilities that it has towards the end of today. Now, I haven't talked about this part yet. Line 14 has transport. And transport is an abstraction inside Test Kitchen, and it's by default is either WinRM or SSH. And it will default to WinRM if it can figure out your node is Windows or otherwise it'll assume SSH. I'm specifically calling out WinRM in this Kitchen YAML just because it would be able to look at my platform name and say, oh, it says Windows in it, so we'll use WinRM. But for example, I'm calling it out just so you know that there's this thing there, transport, that deals with all of the communication back and forth to the machine that we're testing. That is kind of important if you're using a cloud provisioner. So that means you need to be able to communicate out on 5985. You have to be able to go outbound towards port 5985 to a node on the internet, and that can be problematic for some people's corporate proxies. So just something to be aware of. Then we have a verifier. This is, like I said, we're gonna run a pester verifier. So this is gonna let you test the configuration that we lay down, and then we have our platforms. We're going to start out testing 2012 R2 with WMF4. Underneath this, I have some more driver information specified. So the driver, I'm going to specify some details about like which machine image to use, And because we're going to spin up a web server, I'm going to do some port forwarding. And this is information that Vagrant will use to set that up for us. Now, different tools are going to have different capabilities. So this stuff is specific to the driver. One thing I'll point out is you can actually specify a lot of this information at different points in this configuration document. And when they're in a more specific place like this, like for this platform, I'm specifying additional driver information. Those are overrides. If there was a default one set, like if I had set a box file up at the top here and it said box S. Murawski 2012 R2 WMF5, if I would have set that up at the top, then the more specific one for the platform would override it for that individual setting. So we're going to just get rid of that one for now. And then I have I'm also going to set something specific for the provisioner for this node. And I'm going to tell the DSC local configuration manager version that it's WMF4 with the update. And for the provisioner, this is kind of important because the DSC provisioner will set some default values for the local configuration manager based on what version of the LCM you have. And so I'm going to tell it I have WMF4 with update, so that means I can turn on and off debug mode, which can be important as you're going through and testing things. Then finally we have suites. And we're going to start with one suite. So that's one test case that we're going to start with. And I'm supplying some additional provisioner information. I'm going to tell it where my configuration script is. So where the DSC configuration that we're going to work with, and what the name of that configuration is. All right. So we're going to switch over to the shell. I've already done one step of our test process. I got the machine spun up, so we didn't have to wait for that. But I left the output up so that we could see that. Now, depending on how quickly your monitors are refreshing, I'm in my shell, and I'm on a Mac here. It works the same way on Windows. There's really no difference in the behavior. It's a Ruby-based tool, so it's cross-platform in how it behaves. All the command line switches are more Unix style than PowerShell style, so there's a little bit of getting used to with that. But when we start out and we've got our kitchen YAML configured and we want to run some tests, we start by creating our running kitchen create. And that's going to create an instance of each virtual machine for every suite that we have. And we can see what node or what suites are going to get created. If we do kitchen list, that's going to show us all the various suites that we're doing. And right now, we've only got one suite and one platform, so there's only one test in the or one suite in our matrix here. Now, or one instance in the to test. Now, if I added another platform, I would have two instances. If I added another suite, now we're up to 4. And we'll see this as when we add a few things to this configuration here. Now I've created a node. It tells me that the last action was created. My transport's WinRM, my verifier's Pester, my provisioner's DSC, and the driver's vagrant. So I get all the kind of the basic pertinent information out of kitchen list. So I'm just going to type kitchen here, and it's going to give me some basic help. And the commands that we care about are kitchen create, kitchen converge, kitchen verify, and kitchen destroy. Now there's other commands in here, and Kitchen Test will actually do all of those common ones together. It'll just do them all in one cycle for you. And if all your tests pass, it'll destroy the machine and move on to the next test for you. So Kitchen Test is kind of like the full cycle. We're going to step through it so you can see what happens at each step. And if you're stepping through it, you can make some changes and rerun a step so that you have a chance to modify what's actually happened on that machine, and that gives you a chance to kind of experiment a little bit. So we've done Kitchen Create. So our next step is going to be Kitchen Converge. Kitchen Converge is going to configure the LCM. It's going to copy over my DSC configuration script and the module that we're working in. And it's going to error. Oh, yes. It's going to. I should probably show you the configuration we're going to run first and understand why it's going to error. So, as I said, we're in the X-Web administration module. And I'm trying to test the X website resource. That's kind of my end purpose for today's example here. And so I want to see what I actually need to have set up as a minimum, to be able to test and validate that X website works as I expect it to. So I started with a really basic configuration, and if you haven't seen desired state configuration before, there's a new keyword starting in WMF4 called configuration, and I give that configuration a name. Now, unlike PowerShell functions or commandlets, configurations are a single name. There's no verb-noun stuff in DSC configurations, but it still is going to be creating a command inside of our PowerShell runtime. Inside of my configuration, I have to import DSC resource to tell it I want to use the X-Web administration module. And I can use any PowerShell variables, flow control type stuff inside of my configuration document. I'm just assigning a variable in here because as we build out this configuration, that will be handy later. But I'm starting with X website. I want to create a website. X website is a resource that requires some certain properties. And so we're going to start with setting the name and the physical path for the site. Now, we just ran this, and it wasn't so happy with me. And let's see what the error was. The PowerShell DSC resource, MSFT X website, failed to execute test target resource because the PowerShell module web administration is not installed. All right, I just kind of, I didn't read that exactly, but that's basically what it said. So we need to have the web administration module. Well, we can do that if we add to our configuration and say, I want to make sure that there's a Windows feature available and I can do the web server feature. So that should make sure that we have the web administration module there, that all of the basic web server features are there. And because DSC does not guarantee order, I need to put a depends on in my X website here. All right. So I've now tweaked my configuration just a little bit. Oh, and I'll just keep this consistent. Save my document. And I can hop over into my shell again. and we're going to converge again. And this is where I said we can kind of experiment and get things to work as we expect them to. So it's going to create my configuration on that remote node. And while it's actually going out and doing its thing, while I'm running these kitchen tests right now inside of the, from the XWeb's XWeb administration module, I could actually be fixing resources and making sure they work as behaved. You don't need to develop a DSC resource, though, to use Test Kitchen. You can use the DSC provisioner with just the configuration script, and you can install modules from the PowerShell gallery directly. I'll show you the configuration syntax for that towards the end. But you don't actually need to be developing your own DSC resources. As long as you're building a configuration script and you can install it from either an external or an internal PowerShell gallery, you can pull in whatever resources you need and do some testing of your nodes that way. All right, so let's see what happened here. So it ran and it errored, and it says it failed to create the website foobar because the physical path should point to an existing path. All right, that's a good message. We can go back and we can work with that. So I'm going to jump a little bit ahead. We're going to find a couple of more errors. And we need to create a file. We need to create some content. Oh, I'll grab a little more here. So as we get errors, we can keep adding. I've got a few more things that we need to do. One thing that we're going to have a problem with is the default website and new website will want to listen on the same port. So we want to stop the default website. We're going to create some basic. We're going to create a basic index.html that has some known content in it, so we can test to make sure that we're going to get back the content we expect. And the rest is kind of as you saw before. There's some dependencies added to make sure that we don't create our website until after things are ready. So we'll save that. And we're going to run our converge again. Now, if I've done my job right, this should succeed. But we'll let the tool tell us. All right, successfully finished converging. That makes me happy. Now, if you haven't seen the output from a desired state configuration run before, this is the verbose output. And it basically goes through and looks at each resource and starts a test phase. If the test returns true, then it skips your set phase. If it returns false, then it starts your set phase, so that it only changes the things that need to change. Which means that you should feel comfortable running a DSC configuration regularly against your system. All right. So now the configuration's done what we expect. I should be happy, right? Well, I can test to make sure it did what I expect it to do. Let's it's hosting a website that says, hey, let's go find a web browser here, and we should get some content back. All right, it's nothing to write home about, but hey. So it's my configuration management appears to have worked. But I don't necessarily know that it's worked, and I had to manually go punch in a website to verify it. That's not super automated. So what I want to do is write some tests that can run on their own and tell me, hey, the things did what I expect them to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a pester test. And if you haven't played with pester yet, there's been a handful of good video recordings from the PowerShell Summit recently that talk about pester. I believe Mike was just talking about some pester stuff at the start of this event as I was bouncing back into the call here. But pester is definitely a tool you want to get your hands on and get your head around, because it enables a whole lot of great scenarios. So I'm going to create a tests file, and just for convention's sake, I'll do X. Pester tests have a tests.ps1 extension, and by default that's what pester will look for when it goes to run, is it looks for files with that kind of content. So in a pester test, I start with describe, and I'll say my web server. You don't have to be super verbose in what this is. You just need to be able to understand what you're talking about and what's being checked. And I want to make sure that, say, the web server feature is installed. So we're going to get Windows feature, web server, pipe that through where installed, and should not be null or empty. So pester has these matchers like null or empty that will check to make sure that the object coming down the pipeline is not null or empty. And so now I have my first test. So now I can go back into my kitchen, and if we do kitchen list, it's going to show us that my last action's converged. So it's been through the converge phase and successfully converged. And now I can kitchen verify. Now notice I don't actually have to specify anything other than kitchen verify. All the options and things are being driven off of that kitchen YAML document. And as far as what tests to run and things like that, that is all driven off of the convention. I told it where to look for the tests, so it knows what to copy over to the node for it to do so. So it ran pester. Pester is describing the web server, has web server feature installed, and everything passed. That makes me happy. I like passing tests. Let's add something else. Let's say it listens on port 80. And maybe I'm going to do invoke web request, basic parsing. To localhost. And I want to make sure the what's status code. Let's try status code, or let's change this description to returns 200 on, or all right. So we're going to invoke web request to a local host, and we should get back a status code of 200. So I added another test, run my verify. Now I have two tests passing. And maybe I'll write a test here that's not going to return something well. Let's try. So maybe you want to start with a failed test. Starting with failed tests works great for test-driven development. Like if you can actually use Test Kitchen and this type of pattern to write tests for existing infrastructure where you're not going to actually apply a config to it, you just want to validate it. You could build these kind of tests, or you could use the operational validation pattern from the PowerShell team's GitHub org to build these kind of tests, and then write config management to make these tests pass. That's actually a great pattern. So let's say it returns. Let's do. So if you remember, I said that the content from this thing is, or we looked at it was hey, and I'm mistakenly remembering that, and so it should match hello. So let's see what happens there. That should fail. So we had an error. So it says I expected hey to match hello, but it did not. So we get a nice red kind of sprawling out at us and saying, hey, there's an error. And so this lets us know that, hey, this thing failed. So we can fix that. So now we'll get the correct match there. And we'll rerun our verification. And now our tests are passing. Now we could keep iterating on these tests, but like before, I've got some pre-baked ones that we're just going to take and copy in. And we can do all sorts of stuff. Like we can separate out our tests to some of the structural stuff, like, hey, this thing had, what features do I want to care about? I want to make sure that certain web features are installed and certain ones are not, for example. And I can write tests that use flow control, like this, for example, or I can loop over in a collection. And while I've only written 2 tests here, it's going to run tests for each one of these individual features. And so we'll end up with a lot greater test coverage. Now, I wouldn't necessarily put all of that into my configuration management because I don't want to have to assert that 30 different roles are not installed, because that has to get checked every single time. But I can put that into my integration tests, so I know that if I start from a known state, that I'll get out what I expect, and that it won't be enabling things I don't care about. So did I save no. Save the file, and we can run Kitchen Verify again. And now we're going to get a lot more results. So now we have 51 tests that ran, in addition to our checking content, making sure we're listening on port 80, return values, things like that. So really quickly, I now have a way to say that the features I care about are installed, the features I do not care about are not there, and that it behaves the way that I expect it to. So that's one node. What happens when now I need to support this? We want to roll out WMF5 in my environment. So I still have just one type of server, my WMF4 node. What happens when I want to run this from WMF5 as well? Well, I can go into my Kitchen YAML, and I'm going to create a new platform. Unfortunately, I name things consistently, so it's just as easy as doing a little copy, paste, and tweak a few things. I'm going to tell it that I want the DSC local configuration manager to be WMF5. And now, with that, I now have another suite. And it tells me, oh, hey, this one's not verified. So I can go through and I can do kitchen lit or kitchen create, kitchen converge, kitchen verify. The one nice thing about Test Kitchen is if you give it a step that you haven't gotten to with a node, it will do all the previous ones for you. And another neat little trick with Test Kitchen is you can have it run on a subset of nodes by specifying a regex. So if I want to do kitchen verify WMF5, it will look for the WMF5 regex in the instances name, in the instance names, and only run the nodes that it matches. So we're going to kick that off and let that run so we can catch it up to the WMF4 node. And while we're doing that, I'm going to take a look. We're going to take a look at a couple of project sites on GitHub that have a lot of resources for us to use. And I think we may have a question coming in, but while we're waiting for that, so Test Kitchen is hosted on GitHub, and it's github.com/test-kitchen, and it's an active project with a pretty good sized group of maintainers, of which I am one, and we recently added this ecosystem document. And inside in this ecosystem document, we have a number of the and sharing just stopped. Let's fix that. Let me try to share again. All right, and Dylan might have been typing a question. I'm not sure. I don't want that to get lost. If good question. That was in my demo environment, I had both of them forwarded to port 8080, and that's not a good thing. I forgot to change that, and that actually caused some red. So we'll fix that port forwarding. There we go. And that will make things happier. All right. So where we left off before Skype for Business decided it didn't like me anymore was talking about some of the ecosystem and community plugins for Test Kitchen. So Test Kitchen in and of itself is a very lightweight test harness, and pretty much all of the things that it can do are built-in plugins. And so there's a couple plugins that ship right with Test Kitchen, but most of it is external in the ecosystem. And so there's plugins for EC2, DigitalOcean, OpenStack, vCloud Air, SSH for Cisco devices. So there are people who run Test Kitchen against like switches and routers and stuff and things. There are different provisioners like Ansible, Puppet, Salt, DSC, Chef, Azure RM for spinning up nodes using the Azure Release Management APIs. So there's a lot of plugins right now in the ecosystem, and if something's missing, they're really easy to write. I found out. And so I actually maintain Kitchen DSC, Kitchen Pester, and Kitchen Hyper-V. Those are all plugins that I've put out there. And the easiest way to get Test Kitchen and install Test Kitchen is through the Chef Development Kit. So even if you're not going to, if you're doing DSC stuff and you want to do Test Kitchen, the easiest way, because Test Kitchen is Ruby based, Chef DK has a bundled Ruby install, the Chef Development Kit, and so you don't have to care about managing that thing. Basically, you install it, and now you have Test Kitchen available, because Test Kitchen is a tool that we bundle in the Chef Development Kit. And so the easiest way to get started with it, even if you're never going to touch anything else chef related, grab the Chef Development Kit, and Test Kitchen will be at your beck and call. Now, I mentioned that there was going to be I have a fork of XWeb administration out there. So S. Murawski is where my GitHub repository lives. You can find links to that actually out on my blog. I'm working on a few blog posts around Test Kitchen and DSC right now, so next few weeks I'll be blogging some more on this with some more examples. I'll be using the XWeb administration module as my victim for this. And so if you want to see examples of what a kitchen YAML look like, or a kitchen YAML that points at Azure, for example, looks like, or how the tests are structured and things like that. Got some examples there. The Test Kitchen organization also, I've hosted the Kitchen DSC and Kitchen Pester and Kitchen Hyper-V repositories in the Test Kitchen org itself, so they're a little easier to find rather than under my GitHub account. There's some decent documentation in the README for Kitchen DSC, and so you have a lot of options where you can specify, where you want to look for your configuration scripts. You can actually pass in configuration data. So one way that, if you're not familiar with in desired state configuration, you can separate a lot of that environmental data from your structural configuration, which allows you to spin up test environments or different environments more easily. And so if you've separated your data that way, spinning up a node to test in Test Kitchen is really easy, because now you can just supply configuration data that would apply for that particular test environment with right within that kitchen YAML, and you don't have to pass another script or anything else with that. And I'll show you an example of what that looks like in the kitchen YAML in a little bit here. If you do want to have your test scripts have configuration data in them, you can actually do that as well, and just tell me what variable with the configuration data variable. You just tell me what configuration data variable what the name is, and that works as well. And of course, you can configure the LCM how you want. The modules from Gallery name, and Gallery URI allow you, if you have WMF5, to use PowerShell get to go get DSC resources or or PowerShell modules, and you can retrieve from multiple repositories. Ryan asks if there's any plans to provision Test Kitchen in vCenter. There is a vSphere plugin out there. I don't know if it was on the ecosystem page. Let me take a quick look. That's because it's not in its own thing. There is a chef provisioning vSphere gem out there, and that has the vSphere kitchen driver in it. So that should work with your vCenter environment. All right. So Kitchen DSC, and then give you an example of what some of that looks like inside the README there. The Kitchen Pester README is a little bit lighter because there's not really too many options to worry about with Kitchen Pester. You basically say, hey, this is my this is the test tool I want to use, and the only options there that matter are the only room that really matters is test folder, and I'll let you use by default. Test Kitchen will look in test integration, and if you're working with any of the DSC resources off of the PowerShell team's GitHub org, they have a tests folder with an S, and so test and tests looks a little different, and then so then they have tests and then integration. So you can specify that as an override in your Kitchen YAML. So the last thing I wanted to show you here, other than it ran through and finished. So I told it to Kitchen verify, and it created the node, applied my configuration, ran all my tests, and now just by adding in a couple of lines, I've been able to validate that my configuration will run on Windows on WMF4 and WMF5 for Server 2012. Now, if I wanted to go back and if I wanted to backfill and say like maybe I wanted to add in Server 2012 or 2008 R2, I could go in and add more platforms there. If you take a look at some of the chef cookbooks that are out on GitHub, you can see some crazy support matrices and platforms that most of which is tested through Docker, so you don't have to spin up individual machines for all those things, but you can actually get some pretty hairy matrices of test support set up. Now I want to give you an example too of what some additional suite stuff might look like. And so if I wanted to look for or use a different configuration script and supply some configuration data, supplying configuration data in YAML, it will convert this to the hash table and array structure that we need. And one thing I found that's really handy, because YAML is rather finicky about its spacing and punctuation, is find a good YAML, an online YAML validator, and that will help save you some tears of frustration if you've got some spaces out of line. Yes, and that can be kind of frustrating, but once you work through that, you get so much benefit from having your test structured in this common format that when you just go to a new project, you can just type, kitchen test and have it run through a bunch of scenarios for you. It makes it that much easier to pick up the next project. And so I've been lobbying to try to get the PowerShell team to adopt Kitchen DSC or with Test Kitchen as a common framework, because if you look at what they're doing in some of the other test scenarios, it's really difficult to understand what's going on, and I think being able to surface a lot of that in just one configuration file at the root that you can kind of see is pretty helpful. With that, I'm happy to do another test run of this thing, but it's just going to go stand up the Fourth Coffee site, and it does work on WMF4 and WMF5, so spoiler. But with that, I'm opening it up. If any questions, if you don't feel like typing it and you just want to unmute and ask, that's fine too. Otherwise, I will. The other thing I didn't mention is if you don't want to remember all those different GitHub sites, kitchen.ci is the project site, and there's some walkthroughs. The walkthroughs are chef-centric, but they're all applicable pretty much to DSC as well. And we're working actually on making those more generic or providing alternate walkthroughs for other tools as well, because Test Kitchen is not a Chef product. We ship it at Chef, but it's actually a community project that supports a number of different tool chains. So, all right. Any questions?
We'll give everybody a couple minutes in case they're thinking, but I want to go ahead and thank you for presenting for us this month, Steve. And it's several of the tools you mentioned. I was actually at Interop in Las Vegas this past week, and I sat through like some DevOps for networking sessions, and they were using Vagrant and Ansible and different things for configuring network gear. So I didn't see anybody per se using Test Kitchen, but it was they were using YAML files and different things like that. So it's very similar to what you're showing here.
Yep, yeah. Ansible is driven by YAML documents and stuff, and Vagrant is an extremely popular kind of a virtualization abstraction framework because it lets you define a virtual environment in a configuration file and spin it up and tear it down on demand and that kind of thing. And so it's a really handy tool to understand. The key thing I would say about Test Kitchen is you don't have to know a ton of stuff about Test Kitchen itself, but you do need to know about the technologies it uses, right? So if you're going to use the Vagrant driver, you should learn a little bit about how Vagrant behaves because it's calling Vagrant behind the scenes, right? If you're going to use it to provision desired state configuration, you want to learn a little bit about desired state configuration so you know how to look for, for different error types and how to solve those things. Because at the end of the day, Test Kitchen is really just orchestrating calling a bunch of other tools for you in a set pattern and giving you a way to take a look at those. So,
I got a couple questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
More on just straight DSC. Personally, I've been baking with Packer, and I deployed a EC2 in my servers last 10 hours at a time. Mm-hmm. And that's a pretty simple config. Is there a point where DSC is just too much, and it's just better to just run your 3 PowerShell scripts? Is it more based for long-term servers where it's just trying to maintain the state?
That's kind of the standard use case. But even when you're talking about baking an image with Packer, being able to use something like Chef or DSC to do the provisioning helps you as you maintain that over time because Sure. It gives you that more simplified view of what it is. You're caring about what the end state of those things that go into that image are, rather than step 1, step 2, step 3. This is so the scenario you're talking about is actually really similar to the scenario that when people start talking about configuration management and Docker, right? And because at the end of the day, you have an artifact, whether it's the OS image that or the AMI that you're shipping, or it's the or it's a Docker container, and there still is value in leveraging a config management tool to build those things out, even if you're not going to be running it over time on the node. Right, because it's going to go away, and you're going to be replacing it with something new in the next 10 hours.
Right. So you would provision it with, say, like DSC, and then you would bake it, and it would get saved as an AMI, and then you'd be able to run Test Kitchen then to verify the EC2 instance passes all the config pester tests.
So you could what I would be, or you could definitely do it that way. The order I would consider is you build your configuration script that you're going to use in Packer, and that would be what you test in Test Kitchen before you stick it into your pipeline in Packer.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I see what you're saying. So,
Yeah.
okay, I mean, yeah, that's easier to do too.
Yep.
So it's just, all right, cool. And just a one-off question, WinRM is just crazy painful to use. Do you think with OpenSSH coming into the new Windows Server that's going to take over for WinRM?
Maybe. So with for at least Test Kitchen and everything in the Chef ecosystem now, we support native cross-platform negotiate auth. So you don't have to do any tweaking to the WinRM settings. You still do for Packer if you're doing Packer, or Vagrant now supports negotiate auth as well, cross-platform. Thanks a lot to Matt Rock's work, and so that's a little less painful. But yeah, it's still a painful environment in which to work. Test Kitchen tries to abstract a lot of that from you, so a lot of the improvements in the WinRM library on Ruby came from work around Test Kitchen, and so as far as like bulk transferring files over and maintaining sessions over time, we've done a lot of stuff to kind of smooth out some of that pain, but it still isn't great. SSH has promise there for this scenario. I think SSH though is also kind of going the wrong way in management model for Windows. So I have a hard time because SSH is a one-to-one thing. So for this particular scenario, it's a good thing. For overall Windows management in general, not so great. I mean, the PowerShell remoting and scale-out command structure there actually works much better in a cloud management model than SSH.
Oh, okay.
So, for this particular scenario, yeah, SSH would probably be helpful.
Thank you very much, Steve. I appreciate it.
Oh, you bet. Yep, and Mike posted the URL for the Chef DK. And just so you guys know, too, Test Kitchen, for a while, it was rather slowly evolving. And lately, we've been getting out of about a version a month. So if there's, pet bugs or features and stuff like that, we've been pretty active in maintaining that. And like I said, more improvements to the docs are coming relatively soon as well. There's been some work on that side of things. And if you're looking to play with Test Kitchen and you have questions, please hit me up on Twitter or the PowerShell Slack channel, or those are probably the best ways to get a hold of me.
Okay, do we have any more questions?
Yeah, if nobody has any other questions, I'm always happy to chat more at some other point in time. But please give it a spin. Like I said, I'll watch my blog. I'll be blogging about this topic in the very near future here, because I've been getting a lot more questions about it, and there's not a lot of examples yet. So. I do know a couple of organizations, though, that have been using Test Kitchen with DSC specifically quite heavily, and have had a lot of great success. And I'm trying to convince them to do some blogging about it too. So, thanks, Mike.
Yeah, put a link to Steve's blog in there as well. He's got some really good information on there already, and sounds like he's going to have some more soon as well.
And thank you guys all who came out tonight to hang out and listen to me go on for a little while. So appreciate it.
Thank you, Steve. It was an awesome presentation.
My pleasure.